Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again. Today we're going to be continuing our look at the Ian Fleming James Bond books with From Russia with Love. Now, From Russia with Love is a book with a very special place in my heart. It was the first Bond novel I ever read. I found it in a second-hand bookstore, very excited, was really into Bond at that point, so took this as a sign that I should read it, and I read it, and I loved it, and it was that experience that made me, go and buy the whole set and vow to work my way from Casino Royale right until the end, and Live and Let Die quickly killed that dedication. But of those three books that I read as like 13, 14, 15-year-old, From Russia with Love was by far the one that I had the strongest memories of, so I was excited and nervous to be revisiting it after all these years in case it didn't hold up. So that's what this video is largely going to concern itself with. Does it hold up to my very, very fond childhood memories of reading it? Well, let's get started with the plot, shall we? From Russia with Love begins with quite an extended prologue, as James Bond doesn't turn up until about a third of the way in, as the first third of the book concerns itself with all these Smersh operatives coming up with this plan to embarrass the British Secret Service by murdering and creating a scandal around James Bond. During these chapters there are some really nice references to previous Bond stories. Casino Royale, Moonraker, and Live and Let Die all get a mention. It all actually ties in together quite nicely, and it never feels gratuitous. It's just a nice bit of continuity, and I appreciate it. It's just little things like there's this whole boardroom of Smersh heavies, and they're all like musing about like, oh, well, who should we kill? Who should we, what should we do to embarrass our enemies? And they float the idea of killing Mathis from, the French intelligence service in Casino Royale, and that's of course before they settle on Bond. I do just kind of love the idea that this entire villainous scheme is just born out of a bunch of guys like chatting away in a room and trying to figure out how they can look impressive to their superiors by just being like, who would be better to kill than, what that guy said? Let me have a think. Smersh select an agent of theirs known as Red Grant to be the one to actually bump off Bond. And so, as Fleming is, to do, we get a lot of Red Grant's backstory, which is actually really interesting. It covers all of his, homicidal urges and his history, where he grew up, all that kind of stuff, and there's some kind of supernatural element in here, as Red Grant is kind of driven to kill by the full moon. So at any point in the book, I'm expecting him to start growing fur and rip off his clothes and become a werewolf monster. There are an awful lot of characters in this opening section of the book, but there are really only three that matter and play into the story in a great way later on. There's Grant, of course, himself, there's Rosa Klebb, who is head of operations and executions for Smersh, and Tatiana Romanova, a young cipher clerk who is enlisted to falsely defect to the West. She is going to claim that she has fallen in love with James Bond after seeing a picture of his, and so she wants him to come and liberate her. It's very similar to the film in that respect. However, Tatiana is also to offer the British a Russian decoding device known here as a Spectre, as an added incentive to aid her fake defection. However, Romanova is definitely just a pawn in a wider scheme here. She is not privy to the second part of the plan, which involves filming her and Bond having sex, and then splashing those images all over the papers to embarrass MI6. They can say, look at this British agent getting off with this Russian lass in a hotel room, my god, it's the 1950s and we're all so prudish. It's quite amazing that this preamble never feels boring or redundant or really makes you hanker to get to Bond at all, though I'm grateful when we get to James Bond, but it's actually really gripping seeing how this plan comes together and how the duties get relegated and how the pieces are all put into place. I think it's a really good bit of writing. To see it takes up a third of the book. A third of the book is basically telling us what is going to happen in the second, in the next 2/3, but it never gets dull. It's pretty great. So it's only after all that information that we get to Bond himself as he talks through the nature of the mission with M. There's a lot of lip service here given to the reader about how Bond and M would actually convincingly fall for this scheme and kind of go ahead with it. I mean, they're suspicious, of course, but the draw for them is the Spectre device, and it proves to be such a strong draw that Bond is indeed sent to Istanbul, where Tatiana is stationed. Along with the supernatural element of Grant and the full moon, there are just generally a lot of omens and superstitious chat around this point. Bond's secretary warns him not to travel on Friday the 13th, for example, which he ignores. There's a bad storm on the flight. I just feel like we hear a lot more about what Bond's instincts are telling him, and the general, air of foreboding doom throughout much of the book around him, and it's really good. You do kind of feel like there is this theme kind of woven throughout much of the book, and it's really compelling because you are just sort of on your seat, like, expecting something bad to happen, and like, why are all these superstitious things being talked about? Well, it's to create that foreboding mood. Once Bond arrives in Turkey, he meets with Darko Karim, who is the head of the British station in Turkey, and boy is he a character! I'll talk more about him once we get to the individual characters part of this review, but he's just so full of personality and stories, and Karim and Bond make such a great double act in this book. Anyway, after a bit of a sidebar to a gypsy camp where Bond and Karim, watch some ladies fight and get into a bit of a scuffle, Bond and Karim meet with Tanya and plan their route out of Turkey using the Orient Express. Over the course of this, it becomes clear that Tanya does indeed fall in love with Bond, but a tragedy is never far away as Karim is killed by one of 3 Russian agents aboard the Orient Express that the trio were on. As you can probably tell from me talking about this, it is all very similar to what is in the film, really. It's around this point where Red Grant reemerges, posing as a Captain Nash, who Bond assumes has been sent by M to provide extra protection during the trip, as, Karim has been bumped off. I think the film handles this particular development much better. It's very presumptive of Bond to just think, oh yeah, M sent this guy, I've had no word of this, but yeah, sure. Even though he does exchange a secret code with Grant, he's just so lax about it. It's literally just like, at least in the film, he's supposed to be meeting with Nash and Grant poses as him that way. Here it's just like, oh, here's a bloke who's made eye contact with me, he must be a friend. So just as in the film, Grant drugs Tanya and reveals the details of his dastardly plan to 007. He'll shoot Bond and then kill Tanya after leaving their sex film in their luggage. The Spectre device is designed to explode upon being examined, so that would presumably happen as the device is taken over to, Q branch or whatever, and then boom. Of course, there's a brawl between Bond and Grant, and Bond triumphs, thanks in part to a handy gadget from Q branch. And after that, the book comes to rather a quick conclusion. Tanya and the Spectre are delivered, and Bond goes to suss out Rosa Klebb, who is currently in Paris. There's some funny awkwardness here as Bond doesn't expect Klebb to be the short, toad-like woman she's so vividly described as, and so he thinks he's just, literally barged in on some old deer sat in a hotel room. But he quickly figures her out, of course, and she is apprehended by Bond and a returning Mathis after a bit of a scuffle, which brings the book to an end, except for the fact that here Rosa Klebb actually succeeds in stabbing Bond with her poison-tipped bladed shoe, and Bond falls to the floor, gasping for air, and that's actually how we end this particular book. The book literally ends by presumably killing off 007, and from what my little bits of research have told me, that's actually what Fleming intended. He was kinda bored of writing for the character, and, it's easy to get a sense of that boredom after reading Diamonds Are Forever, which just felt like he was just going through the motions, just literally putting words on pages. But I suppose that Russia was a much more enjoyable and rewarding experience for him, as he obviously kept on writing. But certainly this feels like the most polished and well thought out Bond novel I've read in the series so far. I think the plot is fantastic, and it's so enjoyable to read. It's just kind of wonderful. I can't say enough good things about this one. There are so many great side characters in this book, but Bond still shines through really well. He feels like a more fully realised character in this particular book. We get quite a bit of him at home, actually, and how he has this Scottish housekeeper called May. He's a little frustrated and bored with the slower pace of life he has experienced lately, so this adventure really gives him the jumpstart that he needs. His relationship with Tanya is really interesting, and there's actually quite a few mentions of Tiffany Case, because of course the last book ended with him and Tiffany presumably very much in love, going to get married, going to have this wonderful life together, and then we start this book and he's single again. I'm just so unused to Bond girls ever being referred to again or making an appearance again in the film series that it was, you know, quite nice that the book series lets you in a little bit on what happens in between stories. In this case, Smith's case, and Bond were together for a few months and then just broke up. They just kind of drifted apart quite naturally, it seems, and then she went off back to the States with another fella. So Bond seems very much into Tanya when this mission presents itself, and things get steamy with her quite quickly. But unlike Tiffany and Vesper, I don't think Bond really falls in love with Tanya. I guess you could read it that way, and maybe I'm just a bit fatigued with how Bond seems to be falling for pretty much every girl he meets in these books. But I just don't expect Tanya to be hanging around for as much, you know, I don't expect to hear a lot about her at the start of the next book in the series. Speaking of Tanya, let's move on to the supporting characters. She is a bit of a step down from Tiffany when it comes to female companions for 007. She's just kind of bland, I find, but, we have Darko Karim, who has more than enough personality for a book of his own. He makes up for the lack of personality on her side. He's so charismatic and full of wild stories, including one absolutely bizarre, thing. He's talking about, a woman he kidnaps, and he chains her naked to his dining table, underneath it, and he's feeding her scraps from the table and basically treating her like a dog until he, is forced to release her. But he's telling this story about how he just, brutally abused this woman, and it's this horrific story, and he's saying it, and he's so proud of himself when he talks about it. And, yeah, even though it is a really horrific story, and this isn't even just something of the times, I'm pretty sure that anyone in the 1950s reading that would be quite appalled by how he treated this poor woman as well, but it says a lot that even after he's telling all this, horrible stuff that he's done, you actually still quite like the guy. Karim as a character, though, is also very good for Bond, who is very much stuck in a rut, very much bored with his life, and needs that jolt of energy to wake him up again. And Karim has so much energy that, my god, you wouldn't need a Solex agitator to solve an energy crisis. You should just hook this guy up to a generator and there's enough electricity there to keep cities running. The villains are also really great in this book, or rather, Klebb and Grant are. There is a character called Grunstein in here, as in the film, and he's a strategist, a chess player, the architect of the plan, but he doesn't really have much to do with the story other than turning up at the start and coming out and saying I have the most infallible plan in the world, it's 1,000,000% infallible, it's so infallible and brilliant, I'm Grunstein, and then he kind of goes away and that's it really. Klebb is really presented as the main villain of the book, despite her not being the leader of her particular organization. In true Fleming style, she's described as this, disgusting creature with this, bad hygiene, and she's just, pretty much described as being the ugliest woman in the world, so of course she's evil. She's also either bisexual or a lesbian or something, and her non-heteronormative sexuality is supposed to be a part of her ugliness. It's certainly written that way. I'll be very surprised if we ever get a homosexual character from Fleming who isn't a repulsive villain, but hey, this is Fleming, I'm not expecting anything terribly socially progressive, and that's fine, because that's not what I come to these books for. Red Grant is really interesting, and one of my absolute favourite parts of the book is just reading up on his backstory. We get such a big rundown of, where he grew up, how he grew up, what drives him, why he defected, all that stuff, and it's great, it's a compelling read. And then he largely vanishes from the story until turning up really in, towards the middle of the last third of the book. But without that backstory, he wouldn't have seemed half as intimidating as he does. You're not, told explicitly that it's him until a little bit later, because obviously we can't see him, this is not a picture book. But you are just kind of there are just little hints dropped in. It's oh my god, it's him, it's that guy, it's Red Grant. And even though, of course, I knew that from having seen the film, and this is quite a faithful adaptation, the film is quite a faithful adaptation of this book, rather. But even despite that knowledge, I was still kind of on tenterhooks, reading it, and just kind of excited that, oh my god, it's Red Grant, he's back, this is how he's got back into the story. It was great. Something that I find quite interesting, though, is that the film, I think, presents Grant and Bond almost as equals. It's like Grant is truly the dark side of Bond. Here, they're not so much equals, so much as Grant is, like, a superior being. Like, and I mean, he is, like, physically, he's certainly much more, active and strong than Bond is. He's just so cold and intense, and much like Klebb, he just seems like barely human, and that's awesome. He's a great character. So yeah, the From Russia with Love movie is by far the most faithful adaptation of an Ian Fleming novel that I've come across so far. Of course, there are scenes added into the film, like the whole boat chase and stuff at the end is all added in, and while I will say that this plot is fantastic, I think that the film actually does improve on a lot of particular developments, or certainly makes them more palatable and believable than they are necessarily on the page. There are also a small number of things, like minimizing the number of Russian agents who hop on the Orient Express from 3 to 1, and the largest change is, you know, the removal of Smersh as the architects of this whole villainous plan in favor of the nationless organization Spectre. Cubby Broccoli, of course, was very adamant that when they were making these films, you know, one day these films are going to be shown in Russia, and so they avoided a lot of those kind of politics by having this third organization actually playing the East and West off against each other, and I think that works pretty good for the film. Other changes also include, like, making Bond seem less gullible, because he just comes across as just a little too gullible in this book, and I think the film improves on it. It's like, Bond and M at the start of the movie version are quite open about knowing full well that this, like, whole scheme is a trap. They know it's a trap, but they think that they are smarter than the Russians, so it's about outwitting them rather than just going along with it, which is kind of as they do in the book, just with some suspicions. In the book, they're like, well, it might be a trap, but that Spectre device is pretty cool. Maybe we should, you know, just go along with it anyway. Similarly, as I've already talked about, Grant disguised as Nash plays out much better in the movie, with Bond already having supposed to be meeting a captain, but Grant intercepts him before Bond, and takes his place. So the book just has Bond make a few too many assumptions for my liking, and I think the movie version improves on this. And yet, despite the changes that the movie made to the story, changes that I largely agree with and am in favour of, and address, like, issues that I had, if I had to pick between the movie and the book, I would pick the book. They're very similar stories and adventures, but the book thrills and interests me a lot more than the movie does, which is still a great film, don't get me wrong, but the book is just such a fantastic read that if I could only experience either the film or the book again, I'd pick the book. So yeah, when I get to the end of this book series and I'm doing my rankings, expect this one to come pretty high. I think that Moonraker is still my favourite of the books that I've read so far, but this is a very close second. It's such a great spy adventure, and definitely one that you have to read. I'm so glad that my teenage reaction to this book held up over all these years. It had not diminished in excitement or intrigue at all. It's a thoroughly enjoyable read, and definitely not one to skip. Next up in the series is Dr. No, and it marks a shift into completely unknown territory for me. As I talked about earlier on, I'd originally read 3 Bond books before rereading them and starting this, you know, review series, so I had some expectations of where things were going. Now, anything can happen. I'm completely, apart from the occasional sort of detail, like the occasional spoiler, I don't really know much about what to expect, so I'm very intrigued and excited. Dr. No's next. Until then, so long for now, Bond fans.